Hey folks, welcome back. We are wrapping things up here. Chapter 10, we're going to remind ourselves of where we've been over the semester. And yeah, so let's get going. So when you're thinking about dominant and minority relationships, um, one of the things you have to think about is technology. And um, subsistence technology is an important concept to wrap your mind around. As we know, dominant-minority relations are shaped by large social, political, and economic forces, and they change as the broad characteristics of society change. In the colonial United States, minority relations flowed from the colonists' desire to control both land and labor. So, as we know, in the United States, you could not vote early on unless you were a property owner. And of course, those property owners were generally producing labor-intensive crops, and uh, in order to make a profit, they would need to have cheap labor. So things change as new technologies, the Industrial Revolution, increase the productivity of the economy, and eventually this changes every aspect of life in the United States. In the post-industrial society, the processes that allowed upward mobility for European Americans ultimately failed for minority groups. These minority groups they are left with urban poverty, bankrupt cities, and continuing barriers of racial prejudice and institutional discrimination. You can imagine as the labor force changes and we lose a lot of those manufacturing jobs, which were good paying jobs that were the bedrock of the development of the middle class in the United States. As those start to fall to the wayside, you can see where racial tensions would flare back up because the economy is starting to harden and jobs are becoming scarce. Good jobs are becoming scarce. So we have to think about what this emerging information age is and how the emerging information-based high-tech society is unlikely to offer many opportunities for people with lower educational backgrounds and occupational skills. We talked about this in the last chapter with the new immigrants, where those coming into our economy with skills are going to, just by the fact that they have those human capital characteristics like education and some wealth, they're going to do better than those that lack an education and don't possess any wealth when they come to the United States. Upgraded urban educational systems, job training programs, and other community development programs, they might serve as a salvo to this this grim scenario of continued exclusion for uneducated, low-income minority groups, but maybe not. What we do know is that inaction and perpetuation of the status quo will continue to bar a large percentage of the population from the emerging mainstream economy. It's going to keep it mired in competition with newer immigrants for jobs in the low-wage secondary market or in alternative opportunity structures, including crime. We have to remember the importance of the contact situation, group competition, and power and how they play out in this process. The contact situation is key to understanding the development of dominant minority group relations. We talked about this in the first couple of chapters. Immigrant and colonized minority groups is a distinction there's a basic distinction that helps clarify group relations centuries after the initial contact period. We can tell just by the way that the contact situation played out early on whether you're going to have dominant minority relations. Prejudice, racism, and discrimination against African Americans remains formidable in contemporary America. In contrast, prejudice and discrimination against European American groups have nearly disappeared today. So the conditions of these two contact situations greatly influenced how they were able to assimilate in society. And of course, as we've talked about throughout the semester, ethnic enclaves provide another way to integrate, even if that integration is on the outskirts of that society. The relevance of ethnocentrism is largely limited to the actual contact situation, even though it colors things, no pun intended, for the rest of the development of that society. There have been numerous instances which group competition, or even the threat of competition, increased prejudice and led to greater discrimination and more repression. We see this in the United States right now as other groups are becoming more competitive in a changing workforce. You're seeing a pushback from the dominant white population, and prejudice and discrimination are becoming more overt today. Following the initial contact, the superior power of the dominant helps it sustain the minority group's inferior position. But minority groups characteristically use what they have in an attempt to improve their situation. So even though they're in a minority position, they're going to do what they can to improve that condition over time. And if there is at least the idea of upward mobility, these groups will strive to excel past their expected social position. It's obvious that competition and difference in power resources will continue to shape intergroup relations well into the future. The dominant group possesses more power. Whether all of the dominant group is benefiting from the dominant group possessing that power, we can talk about that, but the dominant group clearly possesses more power. 95% of Fortune 500 folks, CEOs, owners of business are white males. Because they're so basic, jobs will continue to be primary objects of competition, but debates about crime and criminal justice, welfare reform, national health care policy, school integration, bilingual education, immigration policy, and multicultural school curricula will continue to separate us along ethnic and racial lines. We see these discussions daily here in the United States. And these resources will be distributed to those who have greater wealth, and those that don't have that wealth will ultimately be without, or will get a degraded type of service compared to someone with wealth, which in turn allows these divisions to reflect fundamental realities about who gets what in the United States. And they'll continue to reflect the distribution of power and stimulate competition along group lines for generations to come. So this struggle is going to continue for some time, folks. We have to remember the importance of intersectionality. Minority group members vary from one another by age, sex, region of residence, level of education, urban versus rural residents, political ideology, and many other variables. The experiences of one segment of the group, for example, college-educated, fourth-generation, native-born Chinese females, may bear little resemblance to the experience of another illegal Chinese male immigrant with less than high school education. And the problems of some members may not be the problems of others. So this is kind of a reminder of the perils of stereotyping. And you cannot assume that one person that is from a particular group has the same life experiences that another person from the same particular group has. Gender, class, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation can combine and recombine to create especially heavy burdens for some. The women of every minority group have tended to take the least desirable, lowest status positions available in the economy, often while trying to raise children and attend to other family needs. Patricia Hill Collins talks about the triple threat of oppression, race, class, gender. As we can see, that threat is a little more complex, but you get the point. A white woman and a African American woman might have the experience of gender discrimination, but to think that the white woman and the black woman share the same type of experience totally disregards the fact that being black is important and maybe as important, if not more important, than being a woman. At one time or another, the woman of every minority group has this argument with the dominant women. This is one of the things that was very contentious in the equal rights movement in the 1970s, is getting white women to understand that they were being discriminatory of African American women, much like men were being discriminatory of women. Others have expected them to provide support for family members, kinship groups, and communities, often sacrificing their own self-interest for the welfare of others. Women are expected to do all of these things and make a living. It's not fair. Understanding the complexities of inequality requires the recognition of the multiple roles we all occupy. Articulating and addressing these difficulties requires the recognition of the complex interactions that we just talked about. Heterosexual women of color and white lesbian women have different goals in life despite the fact that both are women. One must deal with modern racism while the other confronts the pervasive rejection of homosexuality. Something else to keep in mind is, of course, assimilation and pluralism. The idea that assimilation is a linear process is just a naive way of thinking about it. It is not an inevitable process, and we have to realize that groups that may have been assimilated at one time can be ostracized at another. Also, without the support of the notion that there's always a simple, ordered relationship between the various stages of assimilation, acculturation, integration into public institutions, integration into the private sector, and so forth, we have to think that this doesn't always work the same way for each group. We have to remind ourselves this does not always work the same way for each group. And the color of your skin is an extremely important variable into whether this is going to successfully happen for you in the United States. Since the 1960s, as many minority spokespersons have questioned the very desirability of assimilation and pluralistic themes, these have increased in prominence as the commitment of the larger society to racial equality has faltered. So as people begin to realize that assimilation might not be available to them and it might not be in their best interest, you're going to see a much more separatist grouping in reference to how they approach success in the United States, especially in the 21st century.